Most of my Reels runs are on videos where it's easy to give simple responses, all of which can be done in less than a few seconds, maybe a minute if needed. They're quick, easy, and on occasion some research is required. And then there are ones like this. This was something that even in its most stripped down form for the shorts wouldn't have given enough, and the topic deserved way more time and research to give it justice. I honestly enjoy these sorts of challenges, and it gives me more time to work on the subject and provide the information in the long run. So with that introduction out of the way, let us see what the story of Jephthah and his daughter can tell us about God. And because I've been rather laxed in referring to the rules of experimental theology in my last few videos, I'm going to be using them as a baseline in this story. First, let's see what others have written about him, since this is definitely a topic that would have been discussed by theologians, so it's very important for us. Many point out the vow that Jephthah made in Judges chapter 11 verses 30 to 31 and say that it's being reckless, and implying that it could apply to anyone in his household, be it an animal, a slave, a trusted friend, or a member of his own family. They take this as proof that one should avoid making rash oaths and potentially endangering someone in the process, especially in the case of burnt offerings. However, one page in particular that I found, which was drawing parallels between Jephthah and Jesus, mentions one person who doesn't think it refers to human sacrifice. James Jordan put forward an idea that the term used in the Hebrew wasn't meant as a burnt offering, but as ascendance, and it could become a servant of the Lord. I've examined the text to see if it does imply that, and it does seem as though the term alah can refer to ascending as well as being burnt as an offering. They further point out it's out of character for God to be so indifferent to child sacrifices, mentioning many passages that actively spoke out against the particular practices of pagans in the surrounding nations. I'll be honest, I'm less convinced about that, since that should have been looked into by biblical translators later in years, and certainly mentioned in the Amplified Bible or footnotes, and I've not seen that. Further studies suggest to me that the term used, or law, is an absolute, and is very much applied to burnt offerings. And compared with other references to humans being given to the temples as tributes, it is mentioned alongside burnt offerings as a separate thing, and that was used as a law. So, tributes to the temples, one phrase; burnt offerings, this phrase. Two complete separate things, and unfortunately Jephthah's story contains the latter. So this naturally offered more questions. Most obvious, why would God be so demanding of Jephthah's daughter as a burnt offering? But others spring to mind for me. What do we know about Jephthah and his family? What inspired him to make such a vow? Why didn't he deny God and flee with his child? And what was his daughter's response to this about? The first question is actually quite simple to answer. Make a rash vow without understanding what you're saying, you face the consequences. Being that open-ended and blunt in the wording of your vow, and you are in for a world of hurt. If that was a story about making a deal with the devil or a fairy, it would have come out to the same thing, if not that being the best scenario possible. God didn't demand the sacrifice of the daughter, but, like the law of surprise, if something appears out of nowhere, it should by right be the Lord's. That's also possible that she wasn't meant to be the first person out of the house, but was possibly pushed out by another member of the household to dance to the music of her father's return. Why? To cut short Jephthah's line, to show that no whoreson should have any bloodline in Israel. Possible because she was caught doing something she shouldn't, and this is her punishment. But this leads us to another question. What do we know about Jephthah and his family? Well, not a great deal, actually. We know he was born the illegitimate son of the patriarch of Gilead. And as was the way with the Israelites, his brothers drove him out into the wilderness towards Tob, so he wouldn't have any chance of stealing their inheritance, not particularly liking illegitimate children in the family. Jephthah gathered together a group of ruffians, and either became a bandit or a mercenary, since his fame as a warrior was what brought him back to Gilead. It is unclear if he was a devoted Yahwist, since many people he would have bonded with in his raids would have been rejected in similar ways to him, potentially all for the same god, though it's just as likely they would have come from the other pagan tribes. When he was called back to Gilead by the elders, he basically said, "I'll come back if you follow my orders and let me lead this fight." So he came back not as a mercenary, but as a warlord. He was most likely the leader of his small band. And definitely the leader of the armies that the Israelites wanted. This would have granted him at least a decent house in Mizpah, and possibly slaves and animals. This implies he could have been promising anything, or anyone as a burnt offering in his vow. Interestingly, the only time we ever get a mention that he had a daughter is when she was revealed as the first to come out of the house upon his arrival home. Let's be frank here. If this was a story, we would be saying, hang on a minute, who's this lassie who's just walked into the tale and introduced herself as his daughter? Many stories have tales of people dying at random, and some people tragedies as well, but even some children's stories have much better setup for this sort of thing. Who was her mother? Was she even his daughter? Was she just some young floozy who wanted to get the riches of the man who defeated the Ammonites and is now going to be a leader in Israel? Who is she? We don't get any answers, so we have to make assumptions here. We can assume she is Jephthah's daughter from a woman he slept with during his bandit days in Tob. We can assume she wasn't a surprise daughter who just appeared based on her age, and that she was in the house. Any random person who tried to rob the house whilst he was away, we can assume he wouldn't have been that upset about burning them. And given her age, likely her early teens, since she was unmarried but clearly needed a desire to be bedded by a man. She's unlikely to be a surprise baby by his wife or any other girl. According to thebiblejourney.org, it took less than a year for the Ammonites to be destroyed by Jephthah, but we don't even know these dates, let alone his family. So, on the face value of the blunt everyday account, since any bard worthy of the name would have eaten his lyre before he wrote this tragically written tale, we have to assume that she was his daughter, by no surprise, and was very aware of the vow that he had taken. What about the vow itself? What inspired him to make it? It's impossible to tell if he was a serious worshipper of Yahweh, or potentially taking a crossbreed of faith after bonding with pagans and outcasts of the Israelites. this could be why he made such a brash vow. Thinking, this is a test to see if God will listen to me. It worked. Only the result was he now had a debt to pay with God. Why didn't he run away with his daughter, and to hell with his vow? If he wasn't a devoted Yahwist, and merely held a test, he would have done that, wouldn't he? But if God had delivered the Ammonites to him, what might he do to an oath-breaker? It's possible, therefore, that he spoke to a priest of Yahweh and found out that he could fulfill the oath by giving his daughter to the temple and have her remain a temple virgin, but is unlikely since nuns are unknown in Judaism. Furthermore, he had just gained a lot of credit with not only the people of Gilead, but his entire family. So going back on his word to God wasn't going to go down well. But my main question is, what was up with his daughter? Why did she seem so unconcerned by the situation? Many might say she had been brainwashed from a young age, which is possible, but if that was the case, she wouldn't have asked to be sent into the hills to mourn with her friends. This is a darker view than most, but given how some people view the Old Testament, it is likely that this isn't going to be dropped. However, I have a question. What were they doing in the mountains for 2 months? The traditional Jewish mourning period is 7 days, maybe a month. But 2 months? Like any suspicious man, I think there was something going on. The moment you bear in mind she was most likely in her early teens, and she was out there with her friends, who are more than likely to be the same age. Speculation, and nothing to back this up, but really don't have a lot to go on with Jephthah in any case beyond what's there. Since his daughter and her friends, most likely from the bandit group her father led, were possibly influenced by other tribes, it's possible that the likelihood of Jephthah's line continuing through his daughter was in doubt to start with. Okay, I'll come clean. Yes, I am basically saying that she was possibly a lesbian and knew she wouldn't be accepted by the rest of the Israelites, so decided to go out into the mountains with her girls to make love, knowing she'd be burned when she returned anyway, and was going to be locked away without anyone looking up her skirt. Could it be that the very thing she was caught doing, which led to her being sent out to her father when he returned, was that very thing? Now the question that is doubtless on everyone's mind. Why did God allow this? The strange thing is, I don't think God had anything to do with it. Yes, the text does mention the Lord in every single verse surrounding the vow. So, clearly, he had some input. But God didn't speak to Jephthah. And he never demanded anything from him. It's possible that he was illuminated by the Lord in the eyes of the populace, and he made this vow openly, and thus had the Ammonites delivered unto him. But the fact is, we don't get God speaking to him, implies he never had God's go-ahead. God's will is often contrary to our own, but the defeat of the Ammonites was of paramount importance. So, really, Jephthah's rash vow was unneeded. It may seem odd, but Jephthah's daughter died for nothing, and God never asked for her. I'll be the first to admit this wasn't a pleasant time researching this, mostly because there wasn't much to go on with information about this passage. No dates, no details of Jephthah's life before he was asked to help with the fight of the Ammonites, no talk of who his daughter was, only getting 7 verses that accepted she even existed. Nothing on who her mother was, and no idea about what either of them thought in terms of religion. The best summary we have is that Jephthah, and I'm going to use a lot of swear words here, Jephthah was a bastard. Treated like a bastard. Acted like a bastard with his band of thugs. Bargained like a bastard, including in his vow. Fought like a bastard, and in the end had to lose his only child because she was caught in the act with another woman and was pushed out to meet her father, and thus went on a 2-month-long bender in the mountains with her friends. A lot of this is speculation, and little can be verified. So really, this isn't the best work I can do with the information I'm given. This is one of those times where I don't like the amount of detail required in my studies, because it takes ages to find anything usable, let alone anything worthwhile putting in a video. Is there something that can be learned from this? I'd say there is, because this is the best example of education being of high importance. Jephthah was kicked out by his family, and thus, odds are, never received enough study of the Mosaic laws before having to gather snippets from his fellow rejects from their other cultures. This may have led him to think he could make such a vow to gain the Lord's favour. If not the Lord, then certainly that of the Israelites, speaking unto their God, only to find out his words came back to bite him. In a way, this story is an allegory for what happens if we don't know what we are on about, and that it can come back to bite us in the worst possible ways. I find that an awful lot with people online just making comments on things they clearly don't know about. And that's on both sides of the argument. I'm going to be doing a video on that at some point. I'm just needing to get through this list. Many might say this is the very thing we should keep out of schools. But I'd say it's the very thing that we should teach in schools, to show how bad ignorance can be. The fact we know hardly anything about Jephthah, next to nothing about his daughter, and don't even know if he had a wife or lover, illustrates the reason we should seek as much knowledge as possible before trying to argue anything about God. Certainly when we're trying to gain understanding of him. If we have any chance to make an accurate judgment of him, certainly. This could very well be a pagan in the ranks who, instead of offering a vow to Yahweh, gave his only daughter to Molech. It's a weird and more rambling conclusion than I wanted for this video, but ultimately it's the best we've got. And that's all the point. I've said time and again, the Bible isn't a good book, and this proves it. With what little information we have, it doesn't give Jephthah much ground to stand on. And seriously, has to be considered a rushed chronicle rather than a story, since no bard worthy of the name would ever stoop so low as to give such a blunt, featureless tale. You might say back then, of course they wouldn't be as literally narrative as we are, but you got to remember, stories were how they lived their lives, and oral stories have been happening since the start of human speech. So, they knew stories. Stories then would have been good. So stop moaning. This is not a story. It's an account. So remember to keep looking for things to learn, because the way people present them is more often than not more to do with their own beliefs than anything to do with how much there is in the source material. So keep an open mind, stay safe, and God be with you, my friends.